The first lie John Pearson sold was never about money. It was about rescue. He walked into failing companies with clean suits, patient smiles, and language that made panic sound temporary. He spoke of restructuring, liquidity, long-term value. Then he sold the machinery, mortgaged the real estate, stripped the patents, and left payroll to drown. By the time workers realized what had happened, the buildings were half empty and the accounts were already bleeding out. Every collapse looked legal from far enough away. That was his talent. Not theft, framing. By the time he bought into Elena Software Limited, his reputation had already split in two. Bankers called him disciplined. Founders called him poison. Elena heard both versions and chose the one that sounded useful. Pearson promised governance, capital, an IPO roadmap, and access to investors she had spent years trying to reach. But the first document he asked her to sign was not the one that ruined her. Chapter 2. Elena noticed the change only after the signatures were dry. Pearson stopped talking about product and started talking about structure. He replaced her finance lead within 3 weeks, delayed salaries under the language of cash discipline, and pushed her senior engineers into meetings they were never meant to attend. Suddenly, the software company she had built was spending more time discussing asset allocation than code releases. Miriam, 24 then, watched from the corner of conference rooms, saying almost nothing. Pearson liked founders who defended themselves emotionally. Elena did. He turned every objection into proof that she lacked executive maturity. Then he found a private investor willing to lend against the company's intellectual property, but the money never reached the product team. It vanished into fees, debt service, and advisory retainers connected to Pearson's orbit. Elena kept asking where the runway had gone. The answer arrived in a notice she was never supposed to see. Chapter 3. The notice was marked internal, but Miriam found it in a printer tray after midnight. It listed Elena's patents as collateral and the office lease as under review. Pearson had promised expansion. Internally, he was preparing extraction. Miriam said nothing to her mother that night because she wanted to be certain, and certainty came fast. A week later, Pearson announced a temporary leadership transition and suspended Elena from operational control. He blamed missed milestones that his own finance team had engineered. Investors who had praised Elena in public now avoided her calls. Suppliers tightened terms. Staff began leaving one by one, not because they hated Elena, but because they had mortgages. 18 months after Pearson arrived, the company was dead on paper and profitable only in the way carcasses can still be sold. Elena lost the house in the settlement that followed. What broke Miriam was not the bankruptcy, but who appeared at the auction. Chapter 4. Pearson did not attend the auction himself. He sent a broker, a woman with no expression and exact instructions. Miriam watched her bid on office furniture, archived servers, and even framed awards Elena had won 10 years earlier. It was not efficient. It was symbolic. Pearson liked making collapse look administrative. Elena signed the last transfer from a folding chair in a rented law office, then moved into a one-room apartment with 2 boxes, 1 winter coat, and a silence Miriam had never seen in her mother before. That silence became Miriam's education. She stopped asking whether Pearson was unethical. That word was too soft. The question became structural. How did he keep doing this without consequence? So she started building 2 things at once. One was a file on every company Pearson had touched. The other was a predictive AI product no one knew she was coding. Then Pearson unknowingly hired the person most qualified to bury him. Chapter 5. Miriam entered Pearson's corporate office under another name. Dressed plain, resume trimmed down, voice flattened to fit a low-entry analyst role. She wanted proximity, not status. On her first day, she learned something useful. Pearson's team did not hide their methods from junior staff because they did not believe junior staff could interpret them. She could. By day, she sorted deal memos, debt schedules, property valuations, and board summaries. By night, she coded features into her AI app from a borrowed desk across from her mother's bed. 3 months after Elena lost everything, the app landed its first paying clients. A year later, it was spreading through logistics firms and insurers because it predicted operational risk better than products 10 times its price. Miriam used the revenue carefully. She hired lawyers first, then accountants, then operators with no loyalty to charisma. Pearson promoted her twice because she made him money. He never asked why she never celebrated. Chapter 6. As senior analyst, Miriam gained access to the layer beneath Pearson's public story. The deals were not random. He targeted companies with hidden real estate, pension stress, or intellectual property that could be pledged before anyone understood the terms. He preferred founders who still believed relationships mattered. He cultivated local politicians with redevelopment language, reassured banks with disciplined models, and left employees fighting the wrong fires. Miriam mapped the pattern across years and industries. When a manufacturer collapsed in Leeds, its warehouse reappeared inside a property vehicle tied indirectly to Pearson's network. When a healthcare supplier failed, the software licenses were sold to a cousin firm at a discount no market buyer would have accepted. Her file became thousands of pages: emails, transfer records, meeting notes, shell structures, side letters. Yet she kept doing excellent work for him. Inside the office, that made her trusted. Outside the office, she bought the building he thought he controlled. Chapter 7. Miriam never bought the building in her own name. She used layered companies, patient brokers, and a fund manager who understood discretion better than curiosity. The office tower changed hands so quietly that most tenants only noticed when the payment details on rent invoices changed. Pearson didn't. He rarely looked below the top line of any document that did not directly enrich him. That blind spot gave Miriam confidence, but confidence made room for risk. One evening, she found a draft memo on Pearson's desk about a new target: a medical software firm with pension liabilities and a family dispute inside the board. The pattern was repeating in real time. Miriam copied the memo, then noticed security footage mentioned in the attachment log. Someone had started reviewing printer activity on her floor. For the first time, the job she had chosen as camouflage began to look like exposure. And the person watching her was closer than Pearson. Chapter 8. His name was Daniel Voss, Pearson's chief of staff, a man who survived by noticing what others ignored. He stopped by Miriam's desk with coffee she had never asked for and a question that sounded casual. Why was she still in the office so late if her reports were already clean? She answered with a joke about ambition. He laughed, but his eyes held on her computer bag half a second too long. The next week, he gave her more access instead of less, which frightened her more than suspicion would have. It meant he was testing whether she was useful or dangerous. Miriam adjusted. She fed Pearson's team perfect analysis on one deal and quietly slowed another by flagging environmental liabilities no one wanted to own. She began shaping outcomes, not just recording them. Then Daniel invited her into a closed meeting where Pearson spoke more openly than usual. That was when Miriam learned Pearson was preparing to sacrifice one of his own directors. Chapter 9. The director was an old ally named Graham, loyal enough to sign anything and tired enough not to read it. Pearson planned to pin a failed acquisition on him, force a resignation, and use the scandal to distract lenders from a deeper liquidity problem inside the holding company. Miriam understood the shift immediately. Pearson was no longer only hunting weak companies. He was feeding on his own structure to stay ahead of obligations he had layered over years. She copied the board packet, then made her first move outside observation. Through counsel, shell vehicles, and quiet market purchases timed around distressed selling, she began acquiring shares in Pearson's holding company. Not enough to trigger noise, just enough to enter the room later with mathematics on her side. At the same time, Her trust fund began contacting former victims of Pearson's collapses. Not publicly. One by one. The first person to say yes was someone Pearson thought had died bitter and silent. Chapter 10. A former factory owner named Hassan met Miriam in a hotel lounge and brought ledgers older than some of Pearson's analysts. He had lost his business, his marriage, and nearly his mind trying to prove that Pearson's turnaround had been designed as liquidation from the start. Courts had dismissed him years earlier because he lacked money and narrative discipline. Miriam had both. Soon a shipping founder joined, then a retired CFO, then Elena's old patent lawyer carrying email chains no one had wanted to read at the time. Their stories did not match in detail, which made them stronger. Different sectors, same pattern. Promises of growth, quiet transfers, asset-backed borrowing, public blame assigned to management just before collapse. Miriam's attorney began building a case not around outrage, but repetition. Judges trusted repetition. Meanwhile, Pearson began appearing on panels again, speaking about ethical efficiency in distressed markets. Then Daniel Voss sent Miriam a message with no greeting and no context. Chapter 11. Meet me downstairs. Come alone. That was all it said. Miriam went because refusing would have meant more than accepting. Daniel was waiting beside the service entrance, smoking even though he never smoked inside the building. He told her Pearson was about to move cash through a consulting arrangement tied to a Caribbean entity and asked, almost politely, whether she knew why certain document requests had started disappearing from the archive. Miriam denied everything. Daniel nodded like a man confirming a number he had already calculated. Then he did something worse than accuse her. He offered her a future. Pearson was unstable, he said. Men like him eventually overreach. Stay close to me, and when the board changes, you won't go down with him. Miriam realized Daniel was not loyal to Pearson or to truth. He was loyal to succession. He thought he was recruiting her. She left without answering, but Daniel had already decided what silence meant. Chapter 12. Miriam accelerated after that. Delay was now risk. She transferred the full file to the best corporate litigator in the city, a woman named Adrienne Kroll, who charged so much that only the guilty ever complained about her rates. Adrienne didn't need persuasion. She needed chronology, paper, and victims willing to testify under pressure. Miriam gave her all three. The trust fund was expanded to finance claims across jurisdictions, and forensic accountants began tracing Pearson's transactions through entities he assumed were too fragmented to follow. At the same time, Miriam's stake in the holding company crossed the threshold that mattered. Not control on paper, but control in a fragmented boardroom where fear could become a majority overnight. Her mother knew only pieces, until Miriam finally laid the entire strategy out on the apartment table beside unpaid bills from another life. Elena listened, then asked the one question Miriam had not let herself ask. Chapter 13. What happens if you win and become him? Elena's voice was calm, which made it harder to evade. Miriam answered honestly. She had thought about that every week. Revenge that pays too well starts tasting like principle. That was why she had built lawyers, governance, and distance around herself before she built the trap. Elena said nothing for a while, then opened a box she had carried from the old house and placed Pearson's original term sheet on the table. She had kept it all this time. In the margin beside a clause about strategic oversight, Pearson had written in pen, "Founders always sign when they think you see them." Adrienne later called it vanity evidence, the kind juries remembered. The filing was prepared. Damage claims were linked. Emergency motions were timed. One piece remained. Pearson himself needed to walk into a room believing he still had optionality. So Miriam invited him to discuss a fresh, undervalued target. Chapter 14. The invitation came through a mutual business contact Pearson trusted because the man had no imagination. The bait was perfect. an aging industrial software company with depressed revenue, hidden land value, and a founder conflict severe enough to make due diligence feel urgent. Pearson accepted immediately and asked for discretion. Miriam chose his own office tower for the meeting, though by then it was hers through 3 layers of ownership he had never noticed. She arrived with Adrian, Elena, and a hard-sided suitcase that looked too small to matter. Pearson smiled when he saw Elena because he mistook survival for weakness. He offered coffee. Adrian declined. Miriam spoke first, describing the target company in just enough detail to make his pulse visible in his throat. Then she slid one folder across the table. It was not a deal memo. It was the opening complaint, stamped and filed that morning. Pearson did not touch it, but his face changed when he saw the second envelope. Chapter 15. The second envelope contained an eviction notice for the office tower, effective under default provisions triggered by undisclosed control and covenant breaches his team had ignored. Pearson finally looked at Miriam, really looked, and the false name he knew her by dropped out of his expression like a loose screw. Elena said nothing. That silence was part of the design. Adrian explained the claims with surgical brevity. Fraudulent inducement, breach of fiduciary duty, asset stripping, conspiracy, unjust enrichment, and coordinated recovery actions from prior victims whose cases were being revived with new evidence. Pearson laughed once, too loudly, and reached for his phone. Miriam placed the third document on the table before he could dial. It was a board resolution, already supported by a majority stake and signed commitments from directors prepared to remove him as CEO for cause. Daniel Voss, she added softly, had signed at 7:40 that morning. Pearson stared at the name longer than he had looked at Elena in years. Chapter 16. He tried 3 defenses in under a minute. First, denial. Second, outrage. Third, negotiation. None landed. Adrian informed him that service had already been completed in multiple jurisdictions and that an injunction was freezing key transfers. The lenders had been notified. The board was convening upstairs in 20 minutes. Security, now employed by Miriam's property group, was waiting outside not to arrest him, but to escort him once the vote was entered. Pearson turned to Daniel's empty chair, as if betrayal might still reverse itself if witnessed correctly. Miriam almost pitied him then, not because he was falling, but because he still believed collapse was something that happened to other people through paperwork they had failed to read. Elena finally spoke. "You taught us the system," she said. "She just learned it better." By evening, Pearson had lost control of the holding company, the office, and most of the fortune he had hidden in motion. And the next morning, someone new was already shopping for distressed assets. This is the end. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe our channel if you like this story.
Select now another video in our series of family and company dramas. They are all powerful stories of people coming back stronger after they have been humiliated or hurt by family members or their management. Always make sure you stay strong. Let nobody ever tell you what you are worth. You know the best. Of course.